All right, so this is the Murray Amateur Radio Club. This is our advanced topics meeting. I don't know how advanced this is going to end up being, but we'll go through it and see what you guys can get out of it. I decided kind of at the last minute what my subject was going to be this week because I had nothing planned for this week until about Monday night, and I was looking over some of the Rat Pack presentations, and I found one where it was a guy from Boston who participated in the Boston Marathon, and he talked about how they handled the bombing back in 2013. And so he talked about that, but he also talked about some of the basics of what they go over and how they do things. And I thought that would be useful, and decided I would base my meeting today on public service events. So if I can get this to behave. There we go. So what's a public service event? A public service event is any publicly visible activity supported by amateur radio. So typically you're going to see things like bike races, fun runs, parades. We do the Murray Fun Days. We usually set up a booth so that people can get exposed to amateur radio. But it's pretty much anything that's not emergency services related would be considered a public service event. Now, I say that with some grain of salt because you could think of emergency services events as being public service events too, but in the way I'm going to present this, we're talking about non-emergency type events. It does give amateur radio operators a good opportunity to practice using the radios, using message passing, being in net control, communicating not only with other hams, but with other people and interacting with other organizations. And so those things are all good, and they help us to be better amateur radio operators. So we're going to look at a couple of different events. We're going to talk about the Boston Marathon, and then we're going to talk about LOTOJA, which is the Logan to Jackson bike race. So
it starts from Wheeler Park.
It starts in Logan. I believe it is at that main park, and it goes to the base of the Grand Teton Resort up there in Jackson. We'll talk about it.
Like the MS
one. The MS one I didn't talk about, but that'll actually be in about 2 weeks. And we're always looking for operators. So if you're interested in participating, there's probably still room for somebody. All right, so let's talk about the Boston Marathon. The information that I got for this came from the Rat Pack presentation by Steven Schwarm, W3EVE. And you can view his presentation on YouTube at that link if you so desire. I found him to be a very dry speaker, and I thought I'm not going to show this video to you guys because it would be better to just summarize the information and go from there. So let's talk about the Boston Marathon. They usually have over 25,000 participants in the Boston Marathon. It has run every year since 1897. It's the longest running marathon. The only year that they didn't do it was 2020 because of COVID. They run the race on Patriots Day, which is the Monday close to April 19th. It's an actual Massachusetts state holiday, and it's the day of the Battle of Lexington and Concord from the Revolutionary War. So back in 1776, 1777 probably was when that battle was. And that's when they do the Boston Marathon. Now, technically, it's not a marathon. To be considered a legal marathon, the course has to be circular or zigzagged in such a way that the start and end are close to each other. And the reason they do that is because with a straight line course, a tailwind could give you an advantage. And so you can't say, well, I ran the Boston Marathon in 3 hours, but this other marathon took me 5. Well, maybe you had very favorable conditions the day that you ran the Boston Marathon, right? The Boston Marathon is run in a straight line, and so it's not considered an official marathon. It runs through 8 towns or cities, each with their own medical and EMS systems, their own law enforcement, and et cetera. The interesting thing about Massachusetts is there is no unincorporated area in Massachusetts. You are always in a city or a town, no matter where you are in Massachusetts. You might be standing in the middle of the woods and you're in a town, believe it or not. I had this experience one time when I went out to Chelmsford for a work thing, and I was like totally dependent on the GPS to figure out where I was, because the particular road I was driving down this road and I was going west, and then without leaving that road, somehow I was going east. And there was nothing around me but trees. Anywhere I looked was nothing but trees. And every now and then you'd see a house or something. And then all of a sudden there was, Main Street, and I was in the middle of town. But the whole time I was in the town, right? So yeah, Boston and Massachusetts is kind of weird that way. They don't actually have any unincorporated areas. Like around here, you can go up into the Uintas and be out in the middle of nowhere, literally unincorporated, whatever, right? That doesn't happen in Massachusetts. They have over 250 amateur radio operators that support the Boston Marathon every year.
So
It would be, it's an interesting process. So the amateur radio setup is divided into 3 sections. They break it down with the start, the course, and the finish of the race. And each section has different requirements and responsibilities. We're going to talk about each one separately. So first, the start. So we talk about the start of the race. Their main responsibilities include managing the parking, managing the buses, which they use buses to transport the runners. Once the runners get to the end, well, if they left their cars at the beginning, we got to get back 26 miles. So rather than making them ride the train or walk or whatever to get back, they run buses back and forth to transport people. And the start group manages the people, the staff and participants before the race starts. So they keep track of the racing groups, the times that people start, and all of that kind of stuff. They use a single repeater for that's in that area, and they do some simplex as well. They have about 50 amateur radio operators and several hundred volunteers to manage that start. Most of the amateur radio operators involved at the start are staff shadows, so they work directly with staff and volunteers of the race. So this is what the course looks like. And I'm going to see if I can pull my laser pointer up here. I don't know if it'll let me make this any bigger, but I don't think it will. Anyway, can you see like a little red dot floating around there? So this is the start. And you can see these little yellow dots. These dots are 1 per mile, and we'll talk about those in a minute. And so there's 26 of these little dots until you get way up here to the finish. And then there's just 0.2 of a mile to remain until you get to the finish line. Okay. So along the course, they have 26 what they call fluid stations, what we would call hydration stations or water stops, right? They have them every mile. So those are the yellow dots that you saw on the map. And typically they have one on the left side of the course and one on the right side of the course. Now when they set up for this race, they close down this road. So if you happen to live in Boston or the Boston area and you're on the south side of the race and you need to get to the north side of the course, you have to go all the way around. There's no crossing. Once the race is set up, they close that entire road. And so if you're on the left side, you're on the left side. If you're on the right side, you're on the right side, and you don't cross over. So each of the fluid stations has an amateur radio operator, 1 or 2 first aid providers, usually an EMT or a nurse or something like that, 10 to 15 other volunteers, and they use a tactical call sign that starts with W for water stop, or whatever W I assume stands for water. And so they'd be numbered like W01 through W26. And then the L and R indicates if you're on the left side of the course or the right side of the course. So when an amateur radio operator calls in from a fluid station, they're going to be like, I'm W03L and we need these supplies, or we have runners coming through now, or whatever. They also have 26 first aid stations, and they are not spaced equally across the course. They are more closer together closer to the finish of the course. And that's because as people tend to get closer to the finish, they tend to be more exhausted and more likely to need to bail out. And so they have more of them close together at the finish. Each first aid stations has 3 amateur radio operators, 15 to 25 first aid providers, that's EMTs and RNs, and an MD. They actually have a doctor at each first aid station. They also use the tactical call sign, which is F for first aid, 01 A through C, and the A, B, and C are the 3 operators that are at that station. So they could be, any one of those 3 could talk to net control depending on who happens to be the one that they come to with whatever. Let's see. Okay. Let's go to the next page. All right, they run 25 buses for transporting runners who don't finish and for moving other personnel around. Each bus has an amateur radio operator on board and a first aid provider and the driver. And they use a tactical call sign of B01 through B25, B for bus. And then at net control, they have 30 amateur radio operators at net control. And they have about 5, usually 5 support staff from the Red Cross. They use the Red Cross for this because the Red Cross can span and support multiple communities and work with multiple public organizations like police departments and EMS departments. Whereas if they had an individual one from each town, they would need, 8 of them to cover the 8 towns and cities that are traveled through. Net control uses the tactical call sign W1M, which is also a special 1x1 event call sign issued by the FCC, which stands for World's #1 Marathon, which I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what they do. So along the course, they have 7 repeaters. Each repeater covers a separate part of the course. And they also have a linked repeater system that covers the entire course. They also have 2 additional repeaters that are used only for bus traffic. And the net control people also have a backup communications mechanism using the cell phone network. So they normally will use runners that will move between the various operators at net control, but they can use their cell phones in an emergency as a back channel. At the finish line, they have 2 first aid stations, and these are full-scale first aid stations. They have EMTs, they have RNs, they have an MD at each station. They have 50 amateur radio operators. They act as staff shadows. They manage the transportation, and there's always an amateur radio operator with each wheelchair team. Now, you're thinking wheelchair team, what are we doing here? It seems to be the case that sometimes runners, when they get to the end, they are out of it and they cannot move under their own power any further once they cross that finish line. And so they have wheelchairs that they will scoop them up and wheel them off to some place where they can recover. And in order to dispatch those wheelchairs, they have an amateur radio operator that goes with the wheelchair team. So each wheelchair team maybe has 2 people plus an amateur radio operator. And they move those guys around to pick up the runners as they come into the finish and get them to somewhere where they can recover.
You call it one, they have a bunch of wheelchairs there.
Exactly, right? They use 2 repeaters to cover the finish area, and they use simplex. And since some of the places that they need to go or be are indoors or sometimes below ground level, they make use of crossband repeat to be able to get their signal out. So they'll have a vehicle parked out on the street and they'll use their handheld to using crossband repeat to get their signal out to the repeaters. So that's actually, it was a cool thing to hear about that, because I hadn't no idea about that before. This is a picture of their net control area, and you can see they have like tables set up in kind of a V shape, and they have operators scattered around the tables. And they do this so that the runners can be on the outside of the tables and move freely from operator to operator. So if one operator says, I need to get this message to some station, and another operator on the other end is dealing with that station, then the runner will carry the note across, around the table and hand it off to the appropriate operator. Like I said, they have 30 operators at net control. All right, net control is actually not located on or near the course. It's actually located at a public school in Brookline, which is not on the course. It's a couple of miles away, which is actually pretty convenient for them, because they don't have to deal with the course traffic or the spectators or any of that when they're trying to get to net control. All of the operators involved in the race use HTs for communications. Everybody is close enough to a repeater that they don't need a mobile. They don't need the power that a mobile can put out, unless they're, again, at the finish line and they're using crossband repeat. They might have a mobile set up for that. But yeah, they all use HTs, typically 5-watt HTs, and do all other communications that way. EMS contacts are typically handled with a public service system. Each community runs their own, and each aid station's EMS personnel have access to those. And the Red Cross operations group at the finish and at net control use a commercial 800 megahertz rental system for their communications. So that's the basics. But let's talk about some of the things that we have found out from this. We got a comment here. Paul, being a pedantic person, says, if there are 2 fluid stations per mile, wouldn't there be 52 operators, not 50? And yeah, Paul, there probably are 52. So either that or 2 of them just only have 1, but I don't know.
The 2 of those stations are at the beginning and end.
When I say 52, I mean, approximately 50, right? So yeah, there probably are 52.
It is easier to say than 52.
Right. So a couple of things that they have encountered over the years. Oh, that's why. Turn this off. In 2004, the weather was warmer than usual, significantly warmer than usual, and they had 196 runners that needed to be transported from the course to hospitals, and another close to 200 that needed to be transported from the finish line to local hospitals. Ambulances had to be called in from several miles away in some cases, because they hadn't planned for that. And so, that was something that they took to heart. And in the future, from that point, they converted some aid stations to what are essentially field hospitals. And that's when they started staffing an MD at each site. In 2012, they had similar conditions, and they went ahead and upgraded all of the aid stations to be essentially mobile field hospitals. They included features like cooling baths for runners who were overheated and defibrillators. And they had an MD at each aid station. And they also started staffing fluid stations with first aid providers. So that's kind of interesting. Weather conditions could cause the race to be suspended. They could have problems, like if it got too hot, or there was a bad weather condition, like a hailstorm or something like that, and they needed to stop. What are you going to do with 25,000 people out on the street when something like that happens? They had to start planning for that. They planned for suitable shelters for runners along the course. They also scheduled in 30 buses specifically to be used for on-course transport and temporary shelter. Now, yes, I know we said 25 buses at the beginning. This is what came out of that presentation. He said 25 then, and then he said 30 at this point. So for all I know, they could have 50 buses. I don't know how many buses they actually have, but But yeah, so they reserve some buses for on-course transport and to use as temporary shelter. In a lot of cases, a runner who's, going full blast down the course and then has to stop suddenly, they are going to be either overheating or they're going to be chilled because they're not ready for the change from running to not running, right? So they needed to have facilities available where they could shelter those people. In 2013, there was an incident where 2 improvised explosive devices were detonated near the finish area. One was about 2 blocks from the finish, and one was about 4 blocks from the finish. When this happened, the public safety communications were massively disrupted. They were massively overloaded by all of the law enforcement people and EMS people trying to communicate. For some of these organizations, it took over 20 minutes for the organization to notify everybody on the course in their group that what was happening, what was going on. Each of the 8 towns or cities had their own systems, they had their own procedures, they had their own protocols. And the interesting factor is that public safety comms don't use a net control. Now you think they have a dispatcher. The dispatcher is just a resource. They are not actually in control of the net. And typically the way the radio services are used in public service is if the fire chief wants to talk, everybody else shuts up and listens. And same thing for on the law enforcement side, if the police chief wants to talk, everybody else has to listen. And there's no control over who's using the network, right? So with amateur radio, we have our net control, and net control decides who gets to talk and who doesn't. And so they make sure that everybody gets a chance to get their message across. Public service nets don't work that way. So that was an interesting observation from that event. Since 2014, amateur radio operator usage has increased. They are also having hams be backup for the public service communications because they did find that their public service radio systems were overwhelmed by the amount of activity that they needed when the event happened. Now, everything was fine before the bombs went off, right? But once that happened, everything kind of went to hell in a handbasket. And so they were faced with this communications debacle, and they realized that the hams were able to still communicate. There were some incidents where they basically, the last 4 blocks of the race became a crime scene at that point. And so they had to very tightly control who was moving in and out of that area. And so there had to be some on the scene education from amateur radio operators that, hey, we're doing communications, we're supporting these people, and so we need to be here. And that took some convincing to get across to the supported agencies.
One of the reasons amateur picked up on it, interagency communications
Didn't happen, right? Yeah. Yeah, as Ragnar points out, interagency communications wasn't happening. Like I said, each of these 8 towns and cities had their own systems. They had their own talk groups. They had their own, dispatcher and their own protocols and everything. And so that didn't work so well. Basically, facilitating communications is our job as amateur radio operators, especially when we're participating in an event like this. We want to make sure people can communicate and messages can get from where they need to be, get to where they need to be from where they're coming from. And some of the things that they encountered were there were operators who didn't have name tags. And so, you've got an EMS person hollering for help and they didn't know your name. So they're just saying, hey, you, hey, you. And if the amateur radio operator wasn't paying attention or was focused on something else, they didn't necessarily know what was going on. They solved that on the scene by using duct tape with your name written on it and slapped a strap of it on your back and one on your front so that they knew what your name was so they could call you by name. So that was something that they identified as a expedient way of being able to be approachable to the people on the scene. Stephen also pointed out that getting training is critical. There are ARRL courses, there's the FEMA courses, there's the NIMS system that you should be familiar with if you're going to work in an event like this, because making sure that you're passing messages effectively is what we need to do. When we're faced with a huge situation like the bombing, that requires us to step in and be of use. So if you're not using the protocols correctly, if you're not using the phonetic alphabet correctly, all those things contribute to making communications poor, and we want our communications to be good. So those are all good things to pay attention to. And one of the key factors was you could never have enough planning. Planning what you're going to do, how you're going to handle situations. The more planning you can do, the better off you are in any kind of event. All right. So that's the Boston Marathon. Let's talk about LOTOJA. So the information for this was from a presentation that was given by Tyler Griffiths about 9 years ago. You can see his presentation on YouTube. I also found some other more relevant information online, including information from last year as far as like their communications plans and things like that. So LOTOJA is a 206-mile bicycle race. So remember the Boston Marathon all happens within a 26-mile length of the city, right? LOTOJA is 206 miles long from Logan to Jackson Hole. And that brings a whole different set of issues and problems and things, right? So this was originally started in 1983 by two cyclists from Logan who thought, hey, you know what? We don't have a extensive, difficult one-day race like they do in Europe. We should have one. And so they started LOTOJA. The first race, it was 192 miles from Logan to Jackson's Town Square. That's the place with all the antlers, if you're familiar with Jackson. Nowadays, it's considered one of the nation's premier amateur cycling races. It's the longest one-day USAC sanctioned bicycle race in the US. And the riders travel through Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming. And they've moved the finish line to the base of the Jackson Hole Mountain Resort. So some riders will race, others will just ride. So there are two categories of participant in LOTOJA. And some of them are out there trying to get from the start to the finish as fast as they can, and others are just having a nice day. They usually have a little bit over 1,000 participants, and they have to turn people away if they have more than, I think last year they said they had like over 2,000 applicants, and they only had about 1,050 actually get into the race. So that's some big differences between LOTOJA and the Boston Marathon. This is what the course looks like. It basically starts in Logan, kind of moseys its way up into Idaho, goes through some canyons and up and down some hills, meanders through Wyoming a little bit, dips back into Star Valley area, and then ends up in Jackson. It's like I said, about 206 miles. So quite an event. They have over 100 communications volunteers. Not all of them are hams. Most of those are hams, but some are family members of hams who some of them are family members of hams who do like the driving. So you'll have a vehicle and you'll have a ham radio operator and a driver. And they could be a husband-wife team or something like that, or a husband or father and son or something like that. But they have 100 volunteers who are associated with communications. They use multiple repeaters. It's a very wide area, so they need multiple repeaters to cover the different areas. They actually have multiple net control centers. They have 4 separate net controls to run the race. They use simplest frequencies for car to car. They use APRS very heavily on this event. The riders and their support staff may also be hams. Many bicycle riders around here are hams. Also, some of them will use GMRS or FRS to communicate with their support teams and things like that. So that's something that they have to consider, is that there needs to be a provision for riders to communicate as well as the race staff.
Did they see how many of those would be, both on the street?
They didn't say. Some areas along the course don't have cell coverage. Like you could be in a canyon where there is no cell coverage. And so in those cases, the radio is your method of communication. It's your only choice. So if somebody has an accident or is injured or just can't go any further and they're in the middle of a canyon somewhere, the amateur radio operators are their lifeline.
They've set up portable repeaters in some of those canyon areas.
We'll talk about that. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, we're gonna talk about that. So operators on the course, they have the net control. They have 4 separate net controls: Cache, which is based in Logan, Bear Lake, which is based in Montpelier, Idaho, the Star Valley, and then one in Jackson. Each net control has several operators who manage the net in their area, and they use 6 to 7 repeaters, or 8 to 9 different frequencies, including the simplex frequencies. They have what they call feed zones, which you can think of those as like not really aid stations, but areas where the support vehicles can come in contact with the race riders. So they actually have 2 separate routes on the race. They have a route that the riders will take, and they have a route that the support groups can take. The ham radio operators actually ride on the route with the cyclists, but the cyclist support groups are not allowed to do that. There would just be too many of them. They have operators located at these feed zones as well. They have 7 of those, and they are at strategic locations along the course. They have what they call neutral support vehicles. These are vehicles that travel with the riders. They typically, if you're looking at a bicycle race like this, the beginning of this race, from race start until they stop starting is about 90 minutes. And they have groups of riders that peel out every 3 minutes along that period of time. And as you get riders out on the course, they'll tend to group up into packs. I mean, if you've ever driven on the freeway, you've seen how cars will tend to come together in groups, and you'll have an open space of road and then another group of cars, and then an open space and then another group of cars. Cyclists will do the same thing. So they will tend to group up into groups that are going approximately the same speed. And they will typically have a vehicle associated with each of these packs of riders. That's my, hang on a second. Stand by. Let me check this. So for those of you guys on the Zoom, I'm on call tonight, and that was my pager. And it says, okay, oh boy, okay. Let me clear that. That. Just give me a second to take a look at this. And I will look at this. Okay. All right. So I've acknowledged those. That gives me about a half an hour. So we can probably finish this up before I have to deal with that. All right. So let's continue. So the neutral support vehicles, and they call them neutral support because they're not associated with a specific rider, right? So the riders will tend to be usually in teams or groups of associated riders, and the neutral support vehicles are not assigned to a specific rider, for example, or group of riders. So they also have operators at strategic locations, and this can vary depending on the course that particular day. They might be at a specific turn to make sure the riders make the turn. So they'll station somebody at that corner or intersection to make sure that the riders don't miss that and go off the wrong direction. We've had that happen before at some other events that I participated in, and it can cause much confusion and wailing and gnashing of teeth. So they actually take care of that. Yes, yes. When they've ridden their bikes, 10 miles in the wrong direction and have to turn around and go back, that makes people unhappy. They also put some in canyons for relays, places where the repeaters can't reach. They'll put an operator in the middle of the canyon to act as a relay and be able to support that canyon a little bit better. They also have operators assigned to staff shadows. They will be with race officials, with the race director. They have some operators at the start and finish lines. And they also have a group of operators who will go out the night before and set up portable repeaters and link radios and things out in the middle of nowhere. And they'll camp there overnight for a couple of nights during the race and make sure that that stuff stays up and running so that they have the coverage that they need during the event. And so those people will actually get out there and set those up the night before and stay there, 24, 36 hours, whatever it takes to make sure that those facilities are available. They'll deploy portable repeaters. They'll deploy link radios to allow net control to reach repeaters that they might not otherwise be able to reach. And they'll also install digipeaters, which are used for APRS coverage. They typically use tactical call signs. Vehicles are typically blue, yellow, rover, things like that. The APRS IDs that they assign are similar. So all of them start with L for LOTOJA. So like the blue 5 vehicle would be LB05. The feed zone 3 would be LFZ3. And of course, net control is net control. So this is the basic equipment that they recommend people have. At least a 2-meter radio. They recommend a mobile radio, but they have found that if you have an HT, a 5-watt HT, and an external antenna that you can put on top of your vehicle, that's usually good enough in most places along the course. There will be some places where that's not enough. Most of the fixed stations can generally get by with an HT. So the feed zones, the special stations, the corner people and things like that, they can usually get by with an HT. They recommend having extra batteries or some kind of external power solution because the race lasts about 10 hours plus a little bit. They basically say you're going to be on the course from 6:30 in the morning until 8 p.m. So, with some variant of that. Typically, if you're stationed in the end of the race, you're not going to need to be there at 6:30. And if you're at the beginning, you're not going to be there at 10 p.m. They'll have open and closing times for each of the feed stations and each of the places along the way. They recommend people have an APRS tracker. They do have some trackers that they can issue you if you don't have your own, but it's very helpful if you have one. We've done a presentation on APRS a couple of times in here, so you guys should have some idea what that's all about. And then they often recommend you have a second radio, like an HT, that you can use for monitoring the simplex car-to-car frequency, or if you're out of your vehicle, you can listen with that and still be able to get back to your vehicle to communicate. Or they didn't say anything about using crossband repeat, but that sounds like an ideal situation where you'd want to set up crossband repeat on your mobile. They also recommend that everybody have a cell phone. Cell phones are ubiquitous nowadays. I think pretty much every every 10-year-old has one. So if you don't have one of your own, if you don't have one of your own, just find a 10-year-old and I'm sure they've got one you can borrow. But they do recommend that people have a cell phone with them. Some of the things that they have encountered during LOTOJA, weather can be a big issue. You can have really bright sun, rain, sleet, and hail even, and you might have them all during the course of the race, depending on where you're at. In fact, even in the same place, you might have them all, depending on the weather. They usually run this race in September. So, September is starting to get in there into the fall area where you don't really know what the weather's going to be like, especially up in the mountains and some of these canyons that they're in. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Very true. Safety is a big thing for them. Some of the races have been accident-free. Not many of them have been accident-free. Sometimes they've had significant problems and they've had to really do a lot to get people in and out of there. The main thing that they are doing as amateur radio operators in LOTOJA is trying to help the riders and their support vehicles get together. So if they encounter a rider who their bike has had some kind of mechanical problem, the support vehicles will carry wheels with tires already set up and inflated and ready to go. So you could swap out a wheel for somebody. If it's more involved than that, they'll typically take them to the next feed location where they can hook up with their support group. Sometimes they will actually vector support people onto the course to go back to where their rider is and support them directly. So that does happen. One of the interesting things that they mentioned was that in Wyoming, it is illegal for you to drive as slow as the bikes are going. So you have to kind of leapfrog your pack. If you're going with a particular pack of cyclists, you'll drive ahead and then pull off to the side of the road, wait for them to go by and get a mile or two ahead of you, and then pull out, go up, catch them, pass them, go up a little bit further and pull over again. So you're staying close to them, but not directly with them at the speed that they're going.
I've learned that before.
Have you? Did you get a ticket? So the operators are the eyes and the ears of the race. They're out there on the course, right?
Do they have go between these more bikers that are out just to help?
ride marshals. They didn't mention that in the briefing that I watched, but I would be surprised if they didn't have ride marshals. Most of the public service rides that I've worked on, they've had actual people who ride on bikes with the riders, and they have this special ride marshal status. A lot of them will be amateur radio operators, and some of them will carry APRS trackers and things like that as well. So
It's fairly.
it's I mean, I've seen it for a few years, but yeah, it's probably hasn't, they probably weren't doing it 10 years ago or 20 years ago when they started doing this thing, right? So and so, all of the volunteers that are involved, they have to attend the planning meetings that are held before the race. And again, we talked about planning as being super critical, as discovered by the Boston Marathon people. It's critical in any event that you do. Oh, also, I was going to say, in the early days, hams would jump in a vehicle with a mechanic or with a support team or something like that and ride with them. And they determined that it's better for the hams to manage their own vehicle because it's hard to put a mobile radio in a vehicle that's not your vehicle. So, they found that it works out better to actually have the hams carry spare parts and tools and things like that with them and be able to assist the riders on the course rather than having them ride with some bike mechanics.
Took the time away from being on the course. Because when the mechanic stops.
You have to stop.
For 20 minutes.
Yeah.
An hour.
Yeah. So the last thing I have here is this time-lapse video. This is showing the APRS trackers on the course. And I'm gonna go ahead and play this and you'll get to see what this is like. So that's kind of cool. So we don't need to do that again. So my final takeaways from these two events that we talked about, planning is key. If you don't plan, you're going to run into problems and you're not going to know what to do with them. Documentation is super important. Use the standard forms, know where your resources are. Every operator who's involved should have a copy of the race plan. They should have a copy of the communications plan. They should have the frequencies loaded in their radio. They should be ready to go. Everybody should have identification. Make sure that the people know who you are, the other volunteers. If you just walk up to a group of people at an aid station and say, you know, here I am, they're not going to know who you are. They're not going to care or want to deal with you at all. They need to know why you're there and what you're doing. You need to go in and introduce yourself and say what you're there for. Make sure that you have your equipment tested. Make sure you programmed your radios before the event. You don't want to be trying to punch in the frequency standing there on the side of the road with a bicycle upside down in the ditch, right? So, yeah, especially if it's a repeater frequency. Also, make sure you take some supplies with you. Bring some snacks, bring some sunscreen, bring a notebook, bring more than one pen. I made that mistake one time. I only had one pen and my pen stopped working. And all of a sudden I couldn't take notes anymore on my notepad. So I was
If carry pencils, carry a pencil sharpener.
yeah, thanks, Dave. Dave points out if you're gonna carry a pencil, don't forget to bring a pencil sharpener as well. So so those are critical to making the event successful. And most important, have fun. That's what we're out there for. We're out there to help everybody have fun, and we want to have fun too.
So mechanical pencil with a little thing with lead and erasers, and you got it covered.
So my last page on the presentation is a link to the Boston Marathon official site and their communication standards page, and a link to the LOTOJA official site, and a link to their radio operators Bible. So if you would like to check those out after the fact, this will be posted on the website and you'll be able to take a look at that and follow those links and see what you need to find out. And that is all I have for tonight.
Mark? The group up in Logan?
Yes.
You should check them out. They offer, they do a lot of events, but you have to sign up for that group, so they'll send you all the material.
Ragnar points out that BARC, the Bridgerland Amateur Radio Club, which is the club up there in Logan, they do a lot of events. And if you sign up, you can get information on those and be invited to those. Let's see. Yeah. All right. That's all I got, guys. So I'm going to end the recording.